The idea seemed absurd on paper, dumping 25,000 tons of apples onto a field that had been declared agriculturally dead for nearly a decade. It was the kind of plan that earned raised eyebrows and quiet laughter behind closed doors. But someone had to ask the question no one else dared to. What if life could begin again, in a place abandoned by it? The man behind the madness wasn't David Rourke, as many assumed in later reports. Rourke was the spokesperson, the bridge to the public. The real architect was Dr. Caleb Turner, a soil biologist with a reputation for ignoring conventional wisdom. At Riverwood Agricultural Research Facility, tucked deep in the outskirts of Virginia, Turner had spent years studying the way organic matter breaks down and reshapes the soil it touches. His team believed the field once lush, now poisoned by over-farming and pesticide runoff, was the perfect place to test what he called mass-scale biological reset. It was a bold theory. The apples weren't random. They were chosen because of their high sugar content, natural acidity, and biodegradable structure. To Dr. Turner, apples weren't trash. They were fuel. But the town didn't see it that way. Hampton Valley residents had been told for years that nothing would ever grow in that dirt again. Now a group of lab-coated outsiders were piling rotten produce on top of it. Hoping for what? Miracles? Turner never promised miracles. He promised patience. He promised to watch and wait. But few people understood what he was really waiting for. In the decades that followed, rumors swirled about what went on at Riverwood. Had they seen signs early on? Why hadn't they shared the data? Why didn't Turner grant interviews or explain his methods? And most of all, what really happened in those 20 years, buried beneath tons of fermenting fruit, time, and silence. Dr. Caleb Turner was not a man easily moved by doubt, but even he had moments, quiet ones where he questioned what he had set in motion. To understand why he risked everything, you have to go back to the beginning, long before Riverwood, long before the headlines. Caleb was 9 years old when his father first lifted him onto his shoulders in the middle of what he called the Good Grove. Rows and rows of apple trees stretched in every direction, their branches heavy with fruit. The air was thick with the smell of blossoms and sun-warmed leaves. For Caleb, it was more than just a childhood memory. It was the moment he understood what land could be when it was respected, when it was allowed to live. But by the time Caleb returned home from college, that same grove had become something else entirely barren, cracked, dry. Pesticides, over-tilling, and years of monoculture had turned it into a ghost of what it once was. That image stayed with him. It hardened him. It gave him a mission. When the Riverwood Agricultural Research Facility offered him funding to pursue alternative land restoration methods, he didn't hesitate. The dying field on the outskirts of Hampton Valley looked eerily familiar. For Caleb, it was personal. His team, however, wasn't so sure. In early meetings, arguments flared over the feasibility of the apple dump project. Some believed it could trigger a chain reaction of regeneration. Others warned it might attract disease, contaminate the groundwater, or worse, do absolutely nothing. Still, they followed him, even when it meant risking their reputations. Dr. Elaine Meyer, the facility's data systems lead, famously called the project either the boldest restoration in modern agriculture or the most expensive compost pile in history. The land itself had its own story. Once the pride of a local cooperative, it had produced squash, beans, and apples for over a century. But the chemicals came, and the rains didn't. By the late 1990s, the soil had been classified as Grade D, infertile, structurally unstable, and hostile to root systems. Locals called it the Flat, and by the time Riverwood scientists rolled in, most people had stopped even driving past it. In one community hearing, a retired farmer stood up and said flatly, "You're going to poison the county." His words weren't shouted, just spoken with the slow certainty of someone who had buried too many seeds that never grew. And yet, despite the opposition, despite the risk, Caleb Turner moved forward. Not out of pride, but because he remembered what that land used to look like and what it still could be. It began at dawn. A line of freight trucks stretched half a mile down the old county road, their trailers packed with what industry had discarded apples. Thousands of tons of them, rejected for being misshapen, bruised, or simply surplus. The plan, now in motion, could no longer be taken back. Over the course of 9 days, tractors and earth movers pushed load after load into the designated field at Riverwood. To outsiders, it looked like madness, like they were burying the land alive. The stench hit first. Overripe fruit crushed under metal, releasing a wave of rot that drifted through the valley like a warning. Reporters swarmed the scene, snapping photos of scientists in boots and gloves navigating the chaos. One national outlet ran the headline, "The Fruit Fiasco. Government-backed rot dump raises eyebrows and noses." Locals stood on the edge of the site, filming with camcorders, whispering angrily to each other. Protest signs appeared overnight. "Don't rot our water." "No future in fruit piles." "Turner's trash orchard." Inside the Riverwood team, the tension was worse. Arguments became daily routine. Some questioned the project's ethics, others its science. Elaine Meyer threatened to pull the plug entirely after noticing elevated bacteria levels near the perimeter wells. In one meeting, a junior biochemist stood up and shouted, "We're not saving soil, we're creating a disaster." Dr. Caleb Turner didn't respond. He just stared out the window at the growing mountain of decay. In his journal that evening, he wrote only one sentence: "We either let the soil die quietly or risk waking it up the hard way." By the second week, the apples began to collapse under their own weight. Fungal blooms emerged in waves, white, green, then black. The temperature inside the pile rose sharply. Steam rose at dawn, drawing curious crows and unwanted speculation. Caleb insisted the process was going according to plan, but even he couldn't explain what they began to find on day 15. The topsoil, once gray and brittle, had begun to shift. Small pockets of darker, denser earth appeared around the outer ring. "Early microbial activity," one researcher whispered, cautiously hopeful. Under the microscope, the samples told a story no one expected to read. Microfauna once absent were returning. Spores, thread-like fungi, protozoa. Things long considered wiped out by decades of chemical saturation were resurfacing. The team kept it quiet, afraid of looking foolish if it all fell apart. But Caleb knew the smell of change. It wasn't pleasant. It was sharp, sour, unpredictable. The kind of smell that meant life wasn't gone, just waiting. And then, the worms came. Thousands of them. By year 12, what once looked like chaos began to resemble something remarkably familiar. Saplings had multiplied beyond the compost perimeter, forming patterns too symmetrical to be random, but too wild to be planned. Riverwood's research assistants, most of them now graduates and professionals in their own right, returned with handheld scanners, soil kits, and cautious hope. What they found confirmed what some had suspected, but no one had dared to say aloud. Wild apple trees were growing. Not grafted, not engineered, and not planted. They had emerged from the seeds buried in the original dump site, passed through the stomachs of worms, broken down by bacteria, rebuilt by fungus, and rooted in soil that had once been declared sterile. The samples taken from beneath the tree clusters told the rest of the story. Fungal networks, vast, complex mycorrhizae had taken hold beneath the ground, extending in all directions like invisible highways. They carried nutrients between roots, regulated water, and even suppressed invasive weeds. For years, researchers had theorized about this kind of ecological communication, but here, in a forgotten valley that had been written off, it was happening with no human intervention. Then came the birds, small, cautious, flitting between the branches with the sound of possibility in their wings. Next were the deer, thin but confident, returning to graze where new clover and grasses had formed naturally around the growing orchard. Foxes were spotted shortly after, curious but undisturbed by the few scientists who continued to monitor the site from a respectful distance. The field was no longer a test zone. It was a functioning ecosystem. Media outlets reached out to Dr. Caleb Turner with renewed interest. Agricultural organizations nominated him for awards. A global summit on regenerative farming invited him to keynote, offering to cover all expenses and promote his name internationally. But Caleb, always elusive, declined. He responded with a short letter. Nature does not need a narrator. It only needs space. Among the researchers who remained, a quiet realization began to take shape. It wasn't just the apples. It was what they represented: a surrender, a return to natural cycles, left untouched by human interference. The twist was never in the data. It was in the choice to let things rot, to let decay do what it had always done: start something new. By the end of the second decade, the field at Riverwood had changed so dramatically that even locals who once fought against the project could no longer deny what it had become. What was once a dumping ground of rotting fruit and broken trust had now evolved into a thriving, self-sustaining landscape. The wild orchard had expanded, branching out far beyond its original perimeter, drawing the attention of botanists, climate scientists, and even policymakers. Drone images began circulating across the internet, luminous green treetops swaying above what had once been desolate brown earth. The aerial contrast told a story words couldn't fully capture. The United States Department of Agriculture officially declared the site a protected regenerative zone, the first of its kind in the nation's modern agricultural records. Researchers from across the country were granted limited access to observe the ecosystem, document its resilience, and learn what they could. Several international agricultural firms approached Riverwood with offers, some promising millions to license Caleb Turner's so-called rot cycle model. But the offers were left unanswered. By then, Caleb Turner had quietly stepped away from public view. No formal retirement announcement, no farewell conference, no interviews. His lab desk was cleared. His journal, always kept on the far left corner of his desk, was gone. Colleagues assumed he'd returned to his childhood home, but no one ever confirmed it. In a brief note addressed to Riverwood's board of directors, Caleb left only 12 words. "I didn't want credit. I just wanted the land to breathe again." Dr. Ellen Martinez, one of the few team members still working on site, later offered a rare public comment during a university lecture. She stood in front of a projected image of the Riverwood field, dense with trees, buzzing with life, and said, "We didn't just fix the land. We proved that even death decay can be a beginning." What began as a question, a gamble, and a pile of discarded apples had become something far larger than its origin. No one could have predicted that 25,000 tons of industrial waste would not poison the ground, but heal it. That by stepping back and allowing time, rot, and nature to do what they were meant to do, life would return in a form richer and stronger than before. And so the story comes full circle. 20 years ago, the world watched in disgust and disbelief as scientists poured mountains of rotting fruit into a lifeless field. And today they return to that same land to witness what happens when we let go of control. 25,000 tons of rot became the roots of something miraculous. Would you have believed in the apple experiment? Or called it madness like everyone else? When Caleb Turner first proposed the idea, even those closest to him questioned his judgment. To most, it looked like a mistake from the very beginning. Reckless, unscientific, doomed. But sometimes, the greatest breakthroughs don't begin with certainty. They begin with risk, with a willingness to look at what's broken and ask if it can ever be whole again. If this story moved you, imagine what else is possible. Stories like this remind us that failure isn't always the end. It can be the start of something unimaginable. Subscribe for more real-life stories of second chances and impossible transformations. And if you thought this was incredible, wait until you hear about the scientist who used mushrooms to clean up a nuclear site. That story, too, started with doubt and ended with something the world never expected. If this story moved you, imagine what else is possible. The story of Caleb Turner, the Riverwood field, and 25,000 tons of discarded apples wasn't just about science, it was about belief. About choosing to act when no one else would. About risking reputation, time, and certainty for a chance at something better. Subscribe for more real-life stories of second chances and impossible transformations. Stories that challenge what we think is permanent. That remind us healing doesn't always look clean, and sometimes it starts with rot. And if you thought this was incredible, wait until you hear about the scientist who used mushrooms to clean up a nuclear site. Another idea the world laughed at until it started working. And once again, nature proved it's capable of far more than we imagine.